All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Dr. Kalina Lupus is going to actually do the introductions for our speaker this morning, but I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the CCF Speaker Series. Really excited to kick off our 2021-2022 CCF Speaker Series this year with Dr. Stephen Kilgus this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. There is an overflow room in 117. If you can't find a seat or you'd be more comfortable in there, where this will be simultaneously broadcast. A couple of announcements before we get started here are, as always, this is going to be recorded. Another announcement is we are no longer doing the informal lunch meet and greets like we were doing before with the speakers, so please try and get your questions in at the end of this talk. With that, again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Lupus.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I am so happy to welcome everyone back to in-person speaker series. It's exciting. And especially grateful that I get a chance to introduce Dr. Kilgus, who is a personal mentor and a very inspiring colleague. Dr. Kilgus is an associate professor in the school psychology program at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. He is an accomplished researcher whose work focuses on school mental health, social, emotional, and behavioral assessment, and targeted interventions, or what we might call Tier 2. He has authored and contributed to the development of a number of assessments, several of which we use here at the center, including the Social, Academic, and Emotional Behavior Risk Screener, the SABRS, and the Direct Behavior Rating, the DBR. He has received multiple awards from Division 16 of the American Psychology Association, including the Outstanding Dissertation Award and the Leitner-Whitmer Award for Early Career Scholarship, which is one of the highest honors you can receive in Division 16. He has authored over 70 peer-reviewed publications and 10 books or chapters, and currently serves as an associate editor of the Journal of School Psychology. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kilgus.
A lot of times you're asked to write your own bios for these. I did not write that one. That was very gracious, though. Thank you. If I did, though, what kind of person would I be? That'd be awesome. So thanks, everybody, for coming. It's really nice to see you all here. I appreciate your willingness to come listen. My research is in a few different areas, as Kelly pointed out there. What I want to talk to you today, though, is about the research that we've been conducting in the area of social, emotional, and behavioral assessments. A lot of this has relevance to intervention, but the talk today is going to be a little bit more on the assessment side, about the assessments that inform the intervention process. I conduct research in a number of different areas, including universal screening, problem analysis, the type of assessments we would conduct to inform intervention more directly, and progress monitoring to track how kids respond in response to interventions. For the sake of time purposes, I'll just be talking about the first two of those three today. And we'll finish by very briefly talking about some next steps in this research line. So, as folks in this room are probably very aware, a number of schools are beginning to address student social, emotional, and behavioral concerns through multi-tiered systems of support, where we provide supports to all students at Tier 1 with the intention of preventing social, emotional, and behavioral concerns. Tier 2 to those kids who are at targeted, more at-risk levels of those concerns, but really brief interventions that are meant to disrupt the kind of development of that over time. And then Tier 3 supports for the most students with the highest degree of need. Within schools that do these multi-tiered system support, with the most common being positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, seeing some head nods, okay. The logic of what the intervention and prevention strategy should look like at each tier have been pretty much mapped out for a while now. So schools have been implementing this with some degree of understanding of what intervention should look like across these tiers pretty consistently since maybe the late 90s in the aughts. And there's a lot of schools that have been pretty confident about what they can be doing at these levels. Not that there isn't room for improvement, but there's been good understanding about prevention and intervention should look like at this area. What is less well understood, though, well, before I get to that, there's also some consistency in the type of assessments that are done, mostly at Tier 3 for kids with the highest degree of need. A lot of this comes from the field of applied behavior analysis, right? There's been a history of since like the 60s, the inaugural journal issue of Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was 1968, I think, right? So we've been working on this for a while, with the notion being that we identify kids who need support through longer behavior rating scales. We figure out the nature of their needs to design interventions through stuff like functional behavior assessments. And then we engage in progress monitoring through something like direct observation. This is great. It's been around for a while. Tons of research that suggests that this approach to assessment informs effective intervention. The problem is this is really hard to take to scale, including if we want to support a larger number of kids who are, say, receiving Tier 2 support. If you think about your average school, that could be up to 15% of your school population, and that's a lot of kids to try to support through some of these assessment practices, which take a bit of time. So what has happened is that if you look at a lot of schools applying these multi-tiered systems of support, the assessment mostly looks like nothing, or the strategies that they're using aren't that effective and aren't very much founded in science. So let's talk about what exists out there. So we're thinking about screening, about how we identify kids who need support. A lot of schools look at office discipline referrals. Okay, so looking at number of times kids are sent to the office by their teachers or other staff. Problem analysis? Nope. Not much done on the side of what type of assessments we can do to inform intervention. And then for progress monitoring, typically folks look at this through something like a daily progress report. People heard of check in, check out before? Seen some nods. So something very similar to a daily report card, something that we would implement over time. Teachers would rate a kid multiple times throughout the day, right? And at the end of the day, we would look at what percentage of points has the kid earned. So it's kind of part of the intervention, but they track it over time as part of their assessment. Problems with this approach. Number one, ODRs. We know they have limited sensitivity to a wider range of concerns. They're good at identifying kids who are at risk because of externalizing challenges, but they're pretty much limited to that. It's not often that kids are sent to the office because of more internalizing challenges. So we know they're limited in that way. There's also plenty of research right now. I picked one article for brevity, but there's a ton out there that suggests there's a large degree of racial and ethnic disproportionality associated with the delivery of office discipline referrals. So we know that they're much more likely to identify black males in particular. Daily progress reports. Check and check out's been around since probably the 2000s, the aughts. I can tell you there's very large data sets out there with check and check out daily progress report in them. I just received one with 2 million lines of data from a centralized location of folks at the University of Oregon who collects this. To date, there's been one empirical study on the value of daily progress reports for progress monitoring purposes. As I talked to a colleague about this, I was like, why is that? That's crazy. There's tons of data out there. This has been going on for almost 20 years now. What's the deal? And the person's response was, it's not just that people are busy. I think what we know is that there's probably a file drawer problem here, whether it's journals not accepting this or folks saying, well, that didn't work, and on to the next thing. So we know it's the most common way of us evaluating students in school of how they're responding to interventions at Tier 2 is founded on a practice that we don't really know if it's good for progress monitoring purposes. And into that nope area. What we know is that a lot of schools, when they deliver Tier 2 supports, they probably do one thing. Something like a check and check out, for example. Something that's meant to be pretty brief, teacher mediated, and is meant to kind of reinforce kids for their appropriate behavior. But there's also plenty of research that suggests just delivering that intervention in a standard protocol manner in identical fashion for all kids is not likely to be effective for a large proportion of them. Something like a check and check out or a daily report card is really good for kids, often, who like adult attention because the intervention is lousy with adult attention. But if you're not reinforced by that, or if you find that particularly aversive, the intervention is not likely to be effective for you. If the function of your behavior, say the reason why you act out in class is because you're trying to remove yourself from that class, right? Because maybe you find math aversive and you'd rather get sent out of the classroom than to have to show your struggles with math, this intervention might not be for you. So we know is that the absence of that information to tell us what other interventions could we try actually might end up harming kids. There is hope. Okay? So there's research out there suggesting that there are strategies that work, right? There's universal screeners out there that are sensitive to a wide range of concerns. Amanda Allen over here has conducted a meta-analysis on the validity and reliability of screeners for internalizing concerns. Suggests these measures are out there, we just have to use them more effectively. Problem analysis. There's research suggesting you can use really brief measures to inform the modification of Tier 2 supports, right? You can just take an existing strategy, modify it based upon what we know about the student and their needs, and it can become more effective for a broader range of students. We just have to use these measures. And finally, there are brief tools out there that are sensitive to change in response and intervention. Some of the stuff that was just mentioned before, like direct behavior ratings, there's been over, at this point, probably 40 articles across a decade and a half suggesting that they're really good at tracking student progress over time. We just got to use them. So, what do we know? Defensible assessment tools are out there. They exist. However, school needs guidance on what to use, how to use them, and most importantly, how to work with that data. Right? It's one thing to say, we're going to use this measure. It's another to say, I get data from that measure, and now I know how to use it to inform practice. But we also know that even though there's good stuff out there, there's still room for improvement, right? There's still, one of the reasons why a lot of schools have not adopted these assessment tools is because some of them might be not that efficient, because they don't align with their intervention processes. So there's room for improvements in what's out there. And then lastly, there's guidance that is needed for procedures and interpretation of the measures so that folks can say, I collected this, now I know what to do with this information to actually help my kids. So our team kind of back, let's say now, probably the beginning of the 2010s, got together and we were thinking about like, well, what is the type of work that we want to do? What is out there? What do we think is there room for improvement? What we found at that time is that the screeners that were being used in schools, not a lot of them were aligned with the dual factor model of mental health. People heard of this before? Okay, the dual factor model of mental health is essentially that mental health isn't just defined by the absence of psychopathology, right? It's not just that like, oh, you don't have anxiety and depression? You're great, you're good to go, right? The dual factor model says mental health is also defined by the presence of well-being, life satisfaction, all these other things that say like, it actually helps if you're happy, while also not having psychopathology, right? So what we found is there was a lack of measures that looked at both the positive and the negative, right? A lot of the measures that were out there were mostly problem-focused or purely strength-based. There was a lack of measures that did both. On the problem analysis side, some of those measures that are out there that can be used to inform intervention, a lot of them are not super efficient. That can still take quite a bit of time to complete for kids. And if you're working with 15% of your school population to inform intervention, challenging to implement those at scale. Okay. There's also some of in our review of the literature, we found there are some brief measures out there, but they weren't founded in theory at all. They were just putting together an amalgam of information and not necessarily super helpful or aligned with what we know to help kids. And then lastly, as I was referring to before, there's been limited procedural guidance. One of the questions I get most often from schools is, we completed this screener. I'm like, great, how's it going? What do we do with the data? I'm like, yeah, it's an understandable question, right? So well, we know the schools need to not only know what measure should I use, but then what do I do with it after that? So hence our work on the SIBO model, where we try to pull together information about really usable and efficient screeners that measures that we could give to schools, but then also providing a procedural framework through which they could apply those measures that they could use to inform their practice more efficiently. At the root of the SIBO model are these three measures. The model is meant to be flexible in that you could use any measure you want within it if it kind of meets certain criteria. But overall, we've been building out the model while working on these measures. The aforementioned SABRS is part of the universal screening process. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. That's work we've been doing now, for almost a decade. It's kind of crazy to think about. We've also been working on the intervention selection profile, or the ISP, not your internet service provider, the intervention selection profile. And that's work we're currently completing through an IES grant, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then direct behavior ratings, which I won't have time to talk about today, but is founded upon quite a bit of research, including that conducted by Kelly, as well in collaboration with Greg Fabiano, also faculty here. One thing I just wanted to quickly touch on, because this is something that came up. This is kind of one of the paper that Katie Eklund and I wrote back in 2016, kind of like, oh, this will be fun to get it out there. But ended up becoming one of those papers that I think we found it's never the ones you think that are going to make an impact that end up making an impact. But this is one we've actually heard from schools that they enjoy. The notion of screening is often thought of like, well, we use screening to identify kids who need support, and then we provide intervention to them. Right? That's the goal, find kids who need support. But what screening does is it gives you a lot of information about systems as well. How healthy is our school system, right? What is the prevalence of risk throughout the school, or also what is the base rate of risk? Also with individual classrooms. You can go into a school building, and the prevalence of risk within, say, we're talking about elementary school for a second, one classroom can have 0% of their kids are at risk. Maybe that teacher's crushing it when it comes to classroom management. Maybe it's just a good year for that teacher, and they're like, don't tell anybody, I don't want this to go screwy on me. But there's also classrooms that identify 50% of their classroom is at risk. Why might that be? I've heard all the explanations in the world. I'm thinking some of the principals we used to work with as well. It's, well, if this is a new teacher, they're struggling a little bit to build out these classroom management instructional practices. They're struggling a little bit about it. It's also, it's just that year for this teacher. Also, they're really good at classroom management, so we send them all the kids with behavior struggles. Those are rough administrators, just taking out teachers. But then you also hear, this teacher's also struggling with some of their own emotional problems. So either maybe there's some transference to that class, or maybe they're just perceiving that more in others because they're perceiving it in themselves as well. So there's a lot of different reasons why this might exist, but it's one of the reasons why we say to schools, don't just think about which kids can we support, let's think about our systems as well. So the first thing we say to schools is think about your school-wide base rate. Compare that to what you think is a serviceable base rate, the actual percentage of kids across the entire school you think you could actually provide supports to. A lot of schools don't get into screening because they're like, what if we identify 50% of our kids? We can't support 50% of our kids with interventions. Saying, well, think about your existing resources, your existing personnel. What can you feasibly support? If you find your actual base rate of risk exceeds that serviceable base rate, the first thing you should do is think about what you're doing at Tier 1. Can we make that stronger? Could we ensure that plan's being delivered with fidelity? Right? What can we do to beef that up? Because right now, the need is exceeding our resources. Step 2, think about class-wide risk, right? Again, if you see there's a higher degree of support needed within the classroom, it could be that teacher needs support, either through mental health support or through them building up their classroom management and instructional practices. And then lastly, if the classroom's going well, then that's where it actually makes sense to think about individual level interventions. A lot of times within schools, teachers are the mediators of interventions for kids. And if I say to a teacher, hey, we're going to put together a daily report card for 10 of your kids, they're like, that's cute. No, thank you. So our goal should be like, we actually want the context to support effective intervention. And a teacher who has to deliver and coordinate 10 daily report cards isn't a great context for effective service delivery, right? That's a lot. So we want to make sure the context supports intervention. Let's say you are delivering individual level intervention, and you're thinking about how you align your assessments with your interventions. We'd say if you identify a kid as needing support through universal screening, a great place to start might be a standard protocol intervention. Let's say that we want to do something fast, right? And the vast majority of kids, maybe not vast, but anywhere from like 50 to 75% of kids are likely to respond to something. Even if it's not necessarily an individualized support, they're going to respond to you maybe even just doing check and check out or a small group social skills instruction. Okay? A lot of kids will just respond to that. We engage in progress monitoring to see if they actually are responding. If they're responsive, great. Keep progress monitoring. Hopefully things go in the right direction. Eventually you can pay the intervention. If they're non-responsive, this might be when we kick in our problem analysis assessments. Maybe we do a skill assessment to say maybe the kid's engaging in this behavior because they've yet to learn an appropriate alternative behavior. Right? Maybe the kid's calling out in class because they've yet to really build up those skills about raising their hand and waiting. Okay? So we do a skill assessment to see if that's what's going on. Alternatively, we might do a functional assessment to say, well, maybe the kid's engaging in this behavior because it's being reinforced in the classroom. How can we think about how we figure out what's maintaining that behavior, remove reinforcement for that problem behavior, and apply it more appropriately to more positive behaviors? Okay? That can lead to an adapted Tier 2 intervention, right? So maybe we take something now that's a little bit more slightly individualized based upon assessment data, is more relevant to the kid's needs, and we keep progress monitoring and the loop starts over. Okay? What we find is that a lot of schools, I don't have a pointer on me, but I'll kind of just say, a lot of schools go between screening to standard protocol intervention, and it stops. Okay? So our goal is to layer in the assessments that they can use that say, A, is what I'm doing working? I was just talking about Kelly with this on the right over here. The data that I have from check and check out implementation, there are kids that are in it for 2 years. Their goal never, like their daily goal for how many points you earn, never changes once. And I ask them how the intervention is going, like, meh. I'm like, it seems like it's not working, because 2 years is a long time. Okay, so how do we get them to the point where they're making timely decisions in delivering interventions that are actually meant to work in a time frame that is not 2 years long? Okay, so that's the framework we provide to schools about thinking about how we can integrate some of our assessments into their current intervention practices. Folks ever heard of Michael Kane, the validity theorist, not the actor? Amanda's not raising her hand, but she knows. So Kane has developed an argument-based approach to validation. So if we were thinking about the tools that we were building, we kind of use this as our framework to thinking about how we wanted to inform our course of research over time and how we wanted to validate the measures that we were developing to fit within this model. Okay, the notion of Kane essentially is that you build an interpretation use argument. Basically, you lay out a series of inferences that you want to make about a measure, right? You're saying, I hope it predicts constructs X, Y, and Z. I hope it can be used for universal screening and that can differentiate kids who need support from kids who don't, right? I hope that maybe this is a measure of mental health, but I hope it also correlates with academic achievement because that's what these measures are meant to do, right? It's not just that we're predicting mental health, it's just that there's long-term correlates of mental health challenges. So we also want it to predict that. Once you lay out your inferences, it tells you what you want to study, right? So you want to go after evidence for interpretation, the evidence that would support you interpreting the measure in the manner that you intend, relative to constructs, relative to the broad outcomes that you want to predict. There's also evidence for use, and this is the stuff people often skip. Right? So maybe you have a rating scale, you pull out that manual, you look at the reliability and validity evidence that's there, that's great. They often skip the evidence for use that corresponds to, if you use this measure for its intended purpose, does it actually do what it's meant to do? So if you use a screener, does it accurately differentiate kids who need support who don't? If you use a progress monitor, is it actually sensitive to change over time? Because that's what progress monitoring is meant to do. So we often find this stuff is missed, so we want to be really intentional about us specifying what is the evidence we want to collect for use relative to all the measures that we're validating. Okay, talk about some of this universal screening work first. So as mentioned before, we've been doing work on the SABRs. To date, the public versions of these include a teacher report version of this, so something that a teacher would complete for every student in their classroom. And there's also a student self-report version that a kid would complete about themselves. That's 19 items and 20 items respectively. So meant to be just something super short that gives you information about whether or not a kid needs support or not. Okay? We have norm reference cut scores for this that allow you to identify kids as being at low, some, or high risk ranges. You get a total behavior score that corresponds to a student's overall social emotional behavior risk, but then you also break that out into 3 subscales with regard to social functioning, academic functioning, more like academic enablers, motivation, organization, study skills, that type of stuff. And then emotional behavior, which mostly corresponds to internalizing challenges. We've set it up so that there's really high direct alignment between the scales. So this is, for example, the social scale from the SABRs, the teacher measure, and then the social scale from my SABRs, the student version. Arguing, I argue with others. Cooperating with peers, I get along with others. So we're meant to have a high degree of correspondence between the two, that we're really talking about apples and apples when we get the same information from 2 different respondents. This is available through, if folks are so inclined, fastbridge.org, which publishes both of these and can be administered in an online format. This is my bragging slide. We've been busy. So there's been a lot of work that's been done across this, corresponding to both evidence for interpretation and use. So we've evaluated overall its reliability, generalizability, and dependability through generalizability theory studies. We've also looked at validity relative to achievement, academic outcomes, and then some more of your basic structural validity and measurement invariance work. I say basic, but isn't foundational, not bad. On the use side, we've looked at diagnostic accuracy repeatedly. We've looked at treatment utility, as well as about the extent to which this measure actually informs more effective intervention. And then we've also looked at the effect of training, which is all good, the foundational stuff you'd want to see for a measure. But then we've had some more recent work that's been trying to be responsive to some of the questions that we've heard from the field. So folks have told us they have questions about how do we interpret these 4 scores? You give us 4 of them, how do we use them together? And we've also had the question of, okay, we use both the teacher and the student version, they don't align fully, what the heck do we do, right? And if there's anything that schools want, they want rules, right? The data said this, tell me I need to do this, right? So as a psychologist, I usually say, well, it's a gray area, and no one likes that. So we've been trying to be more specific about what we can do for them, still knowing there's still gray area. So it should say, thanks, Mac autocorrection. That should say motivating question number 1. Was, now that we have these data, what do we do with it? And also related to that, how do we make sense of these 4 different scores? So we'll talk about a paper that came out in Journal School Psychology a few years back. We looked at the SABR's performance in a sample of 1,243 students from the K to 8 range. Actually, it should be K to 5. That's a typo. But we had each teacher screen all the students in the classroom for whom we had consent. We started off by looking at the structural validity of the tool. People heard of bifactor models before? Yeah. Seen some nods. Cool. Welcome, nerds. So what we found is essentially a bifactor model fit the data, where essentially every item corresponded to a total behavior factor, an overall indicator of risk, and each item also corresponded to a subfactor. A bifactor model is kind of like a higher order factor model, except the relationship between the total behavior factor and the subfactors is not mediated by the subfactor. Essentially, these relationships are independent. And so what happens is the total behavior factor comes in and accounts for as much variance as it can. And then the subfactors then come in and account for the residual variance between the items that exist there. We found that fit well. We then did some item response theory. There's a lot of information on this slide, but I want you to pay attention to is that general A column and that narrow A column. Do we see that? Those are discrimination parameters. Essentially what we look for is it speaks to the relationship between an item and the corresponding factor, with values over 1 usually indicating like a good loading of an item on that factor. What we find here is that really items correspond really well to the total factor, with items kind of up in like the values in like the 3, 4, 5 range. The narrow area, it's okay, but then 2 of those items are near 0. So it basically says after accounting for the relationship between those items and the overall factor, there's not much left to explain, right? It seems that they correspond to overall risk. The academic behavior items fared a little bit better. There was a relationship between both the total and the narrow. Emotional, we had 2 items that didn't fall out there. So we're saying overall, it seems like the measure's a really good indicator of overall risk, but a little bit more inconsistent with what we think about the narrow area functioning. We then went ahead and calculate some omega reliability statistics. That first column there that just looks like a plain W, its omega symbol, basically speaks for just like omega not controlling for anything else. So internal consistency of these items within a scale, just looking at that, with values closer to 1 being preferable. What we find is good reliability at this level. Over there is omega hierarchical. That's basically saying what is the consistency and reliability of the items within a scale after accounting for the other scales. So basically what we find here is that the items still are reliable for that overall factor, but once we've accounted for that, there's not much reliability for the subfactors. Okay? So what was our takeaway? You really should be spending most of your time focusing on that overall score. Schools love talking about the subscale scores because they're interesting. You kind of dig into the data. What we found is since we published this, there's been about 3 other measures that have come out and concluded the same thing about their screeners. About really the most reliable indicator we have of student risk are these overall total behavior or just general indicators of risk. So we've laid out kind of a model for how we should be interpreting these scores for schools. Start off by thinking about, on the total behavior score, is a student at risk or not? If they're not, great. If they are, let's interpret some subscale scores and thinking about what might the nature of that risk be. Maybe you think about how different interventions align with each of these areas, like a social, academic, or emotional concern. And then from there, you progress monitor. But saying really we should start off our initial conversation be centered on a total behavior score. And we've done some other research that has borne this out. Okay, motivating question number 2. The SABRs and the MySABR scores don't always agree. What do we do? Or is rater disagreement normal? So we worked with Fastbridge to get a sample of 24,000 students. I don't often get to analyze data that includes 24,000 students, so it's a blast when we can. What we did is we limited the data set to schools that only screened 80% or more of their students. What we find is still a lot of schools will just say, oh, we'll just complete these measures for kids who we think need support. Problem is the measure's meant to tell you that. So we just limited to schools that actually use this measure in a universal fashion. We included students from the grades 5 through 12 range so that we could have information both what the teacher said about them as well as the student one. So the data set was limited to kids who had both a SABRs and a MySABR score. Okay? So we had that, and also from Fastbridge we got information. They have computer adaptive tests for students' reading and mathematics performance. So really high performing measures of student academic achievement. What we wanted to do here was use latent profile analysis to get an understanding of different profiles emerge corresponding to rater agreement or rater disagreement. Basically, could we identify general categories about the extent to which these scores overlapped with each other? Okay? Took a 3-step process by which we started out just looking at the basic factor model that included, the basic profile looking at information from both the savers and the my-savers. We then looked at the extent to which these profiles corresponded to certain covariates, including student gender, student race and ethnicity, special education status, and grade. And then finally, we looked at what extent we could differentiate the profiles based upon reading and math performance. Part of latent profile analysis, if you're not familiar with it, is looking at the fit of the different profile models. Unfortunately, latent profile analysis doesn't have like a confirmatory factor analysis or structural equation model that says, oh, if you see fit above this, that model's good. Fit is done in a relative fashion in latent profile analysis, where basically we have to look like, is 2 better than 1? Is 3 better than 2? Is 4 better than 3? So forth and so on. What happens with really large samples is that these fit criteria of here of AIC, BIC, et cetera, they're sensitive to sample size in the sense that we basically find the more like profiles you have in your model, the better it's going to keep fitting. It basically rewards you for making more complex models. So what we want to find here is not just that these values are going down, right? Because lower values of AIC, BIC would indicate better fit. What we have to look for here is basically where does the big jumps in going down stop, right? Where do we start to see kind of big changes in how much fit is improving? I love red boxes. They help, okay? So we find here, so when we start up looking at this, we see jumps like down of like 189,163, 163 to 158, 158 to 153, like 5,000 jumps. And then we're down to like 1,000, 2,000, 1,000. So we felt good about saying probably it's a 4-profile model that makes the most sense. What does that look like? Let's walk through it. Well, we have over here these first 3 values to the left of the dash mark correspond to, within these profiles, average scores per the student self-report ratings, okay, for the academic, emotional, and social. What we have on the right is, within those same profiles, the teacher scores, okay? What we characterize these is for this green value is where teachers and students agree that the student's doing well. Higher scores are better social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. Kids doing better. So that's what we labeled that as high. Teachers and students agree the kid's doing okay. The red is low, okay, where they correspond and they agree that the kid is struggling. Blue, they agree they're kind of in that mid zone. And then we have pink, where that's a model where basically the kids are telling us, I'm struggling social emotionally, and the parent and the teachers are like, they're cool, right? Kind of an interesting finding. Usually what we see in the literature and what people refer to is this kind of this faking from kids in self-report. They're more likely to say, hey, I'm cool, leave me alone. But we're seeing this model is the exact opposite thing, where we're seeing kids saying, I have concerns, and the teachers aren't seeing it. Where it gets interesting is when we start looking at reading and math. So these are average scores within these profiles relative to reading and math, with higher scores being better. That disagreeing group doesn't look that different from mid, or high kids. Where basically that these are kids that are performing well academically. Teachers think they're doing fine social emotionally, but they're not seeing that, and they're reporting that they have concerns as well. So is that teachers potentially viewing students as functioning well given their academic performance, or other indicators that would align with that, right? The teachers just see, hey, it looks like everything's going fine, where the kid at these levels saying, like, actually stuff's going on inside that you might not be able to see through my behavior. Andy De Los Reyes has done some work in clinical psych about understanding why we might see discrepancies between informants. What he often finds is that within schools and other applied settings, we basically only give credit to data that agrees. Like, oh, the teacher and the student agreed, perfect. It looks like we can interpret these data, right? We give more credence to when there's converging information. What he's been saying, though, is this diverging operation, there actually might be some really interesting findings about why scores diverge. Like, for example, research suggests that when you see a student rating themselves as engaging in more externalizing behaviors than what a parent sees, that often correlates with disengaged parenting practices. So what seems like there's actually signal in the noise. There's reasons why there might be disagreement. So that we actually shouldn't be looking for converging operations. We should be looking for diverging because they tell us a bit of the story. So we were actually happy to see that in our findings. And I will say, anecdotally, I get a lot of schools coming up to me and saying, kids are rating themselves a lot worse than what the teachers are saying. What, are the measures not performing well? I'm like, actually, there's a high degree of need right now that teachers might not necessarily always be able to see in their kids, particularly when we get to like the middle school and high school level, where those teachers might only be getting to see kids 45 minutes 4 times a week. Whew. That was screening. When you leave questions for the end, that leaves little time for water breaks, and which is awkward with the math, so give me a second. Oh, and that's what I look like. So the purpose of our project is meant to support the development of the intervention selection profile. That's our fancy logo, and work that's been funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. The phases of our project were meant to support the initial development, refinement, and testing of 2 ISP measures, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We also wanted to focus on development of training. So basically, the developing of training protocols that would get schools, get educators to understand how to collect the data effectively, and then how to interpret it effectively. You might notice this is a theme through my work. And then also phase 3 is focusing on treatment utility. So this year, should have been last year, thanks COVID, is focusing on doing a series of single case designs where we basically collect these measures and use it to identify matched and mismatched interventions. We then apply them to kids, and hopefully they do better under match, suggesting that our measure actually gave us good information that led to more effective interventions. So why do we develop 2 measures? So people heard of the dichotomy between skill and performance deficits before, the notion that a kid might be engaging in problem behavior because they have a skill deficit. They haven't learned the more appropriate behavior. Or they already know that behavior, they are just not receiving sufficient reinforcement for it. So it's more of a performance deficit, not a skill deficit. So we think about 2 of the major reasons for why kids engage in problem behavior. 1, they've yet to learn the appropriate alternative, or 2, they've learned it, they're just not sufficiently reinforced. If they haven't learned it, we would call that an acquisition deficit in some skill. We would complete a skill assessment to say, well, which skills are they actually missing? So that therefore I can then target those through maybe small group instruction to actually teach kids those skills. So something like an instructional intervention, like small group social skills. The has yet to learn, we would describe that as more of a performance deficit. They have it, they're just not using it consistently. We might complete a functional behavior assessment to understand why. What reinforcement are they not receiving for this? Or what other problem behaviors are being reinforced right now? So we can address that through something like a contingency management intervention, something like a daily report card, for example. We developed the ISP skills, is to be a brief skill assessment that could be used at Tier 2, something really short and sweet. We also developed the ISP function, which is also meant to be a very brief and efficient measure of student functional behavior assessment. I was describing a colleague about this grant, and I talked about the 2 measures. She goes, oh, you got 2 grants. I said, no, we got 1 to do 2. She's like, I seem like that feels really inefficient, like you're doing too much work. I said, maybe. I think you're right. So what I just want to talk about today is the ISP skills. The ISP skills is a 14-item measure, so even shorter than the SABRs. That's meant to give us information about a student's social-emotional skills. I'll tell you about those in a second, as well as their academic enabling skills, so stuff that's more tied to the performance in the academic environment. It's founded upon diagnostic classification modeling. The scoring approach to this is founded upon DCM. We'll talk about DCM in a few minutes. It's meant to, all the items that are included in it are meant to be broader indicators of a student's performance, their functioning within each of these skill areas. And also instead of just using like a kind of standard Likert form of saying like, how often does this kid display the behavior? Never, sometimes, often, almost always. We used a 5-item behavioral anchored rating scale where over here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, we have the item definitions over here, but then we also give an operational definition of what we mean by that. So oftentimes you'll hear this from people completing ratings, like what does never mean? You're like, I don't know, use your best guess. And so here we try to actually give an operational definition of what it means. Okay. So the constructs that we're tapping into on the social emotional side are aligned with CASEL. Folks have heard of CASEL before, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. So we get those big five that CASEL specified, the big 5 areas for social emotional functioning. On the academic enabling side, we have 3 broad scales corresponding to student motivation, student engagement with instruction, and then student study skills. These would be the skills that we think would actually allow a student to engage with the work and benefit from instruction, right? If you're not doing these things, you're not necessarily going to be able to acquire information and be able to demonstrate your skill. Hence why we're focused on them. In year 1 of our project, we did across 2 states, one of which was in Florida, which were the second site of our project. So across 17 schools and 196 teachers, we completed these measures for 877 students. This is a lot of information, right? So for every kid, we completed the SSIS as a measure of social skills, the DESA as a measure of student social emotional skills, and the ACEs as a measure of academic enablers. Each teacher rated 3 randomly selected students from their classroom. So this wasn't just for kids with problematic behavior. This is meant to be a broader range of student concerns. And then, they rated, and then 3 randomly selected, and then 2 that they selected, because we wanted to get some buy-in. So they completed those measures. We randomized the order of measure presentation within this, and then we also did a planned missing data design. We randomly dropped 20% of the items for each kid, with the goal being that data would truly be missing completely at random, so that we could then impute that data at the end, while cutting down the amount of information teachers had to provide us for each kid that they rated. Who likes formulas? Fine, that's cool. Essentially what diagnostic classification modeling is, it's a confirmatory, multidimensional, latent variable modeling approach. Very similar to item response theory in a lot of ways, okay? DCM is distinct in a few different ways, though. So for example, we can model each item as giving us information about multiple skills at the same time. DCM was mostly born in math. So you know, like if you have a student that completes an item in calculus, that information isn't just about their calculus ability. It might get into very lower level skills like addition, subtraction, division, and all this other geometry stuff that might come into it. So we know that information isn't just about one construct. It can tap into multiple skills at once. Our goal was to take this and extend it into social emotional skills as well. So each item might give you some information about their self-awareness, but it also might speak to their social awareness as well at the same time. And DCM allows that. The nice thing about that is, if each item is giving you information about multiple attributes, you need fewer items. So it allows for the designing of more efficient measures. IRT, item response theory, the scores essentially you get for those are maybe like an indicator of latent ability. So like, let's say if it's math, like your math ability. The scores you get from DCM is the probability of skill mastery from 0 to 1, which is really nice for a measure of skills. Basically, at the end of it, we can give you a score report that says, here's the probability that the kid has mastered these 8 skills. The first thing you have to do in building a DCM model is build a Q matrix, where essentially you take each item and basically say, I think it corresponds to this attribute, and it doesn't correspond to those other ones, the 1s and 0s. Okay? The nice thing about this, the confirmatory kind of model fit approach for Q matrices in DCM, is at the end, basically the model fit that you get back is the model tells you, here's what you missed, based upon our observed data of where you said that like this item corresponds to this attribute. So the initial Q matrix was created in a kind of consensus building process by 5 experts in social emotional skill development. And basically, they missed 2, those asterisks that you see on that table. Kind of hard to see in this light. But essentially, they only missed 2 in their assignment of items to attributes, which we're actually happy to see. And then they missed none on the academic enabling side. So there's a little bit more straightforward correspondence on this one, where each item just corresponds to one attribute. But we saw on the social emotional side, there's some nice overlap of one item to multiple attributes. Okay, graphs are better than formulas. We can all agree with that, right? Okay. So essentially what we have here is this is looking at a scenario with the probability of basically a kid being rated as often or almost always on an item, basically indicating they have this skill as represented in the item, given the model predicting that they've either mastered that skill or not. So for this particular item corresponds to attribute just 2. Where is this? Here we go, here. So this is item 2 that only corresponds to attribute 2. Okay? Our model would basically predict that if they had not yet mastered that skill, the probability of being rated as often or almost always on that is only at 0.05. We would then predict that they would be rated as often or almost always at is 0.98 if the model suggests that they mastered that skill already. Where it gets a little fancier is if we have items that correspond to multiple attributes. So item 3 corresponds to attribute 1 and 3, or skill 1 and 3. Okay? If the model predicts they haven't mastered any of them, it's 0.01 that they're going to be rated highly. If they've mastered only skill 1, or attribute 1 in this, still low. So you can see that over here. I don't know if I'm going to step out of the light for a second. It's really hard to see here, but this is 0, 0. They haven't mastered any skill. 1, 0, they mastered the first. 0, 1, they mastered the second. And then 1, 1, they mastered both. Don't know if you can squint and see that. But basically, we're seeing that the model is telling us the measure is working well, so that we only see high probability of skill mastery when the kid is predicted to have mastered, to have acquired both attributes that are corresponding for these items. Gets really interesting, and I'll save you some time and headspace when you start thinking about now items that correspond to 3 different attributes. And what you see in some of these is that there seem to be certain attributes that are really driving probability of an item being answered as often or almost always. Where in this one, it seems like basically if you have skill 1, you have a decent chance of being rated as possessing that item. This was just fun for me and starting to look. One of the first things you do, all good data management practices, right? You get a data set, you start pulling up your histograms because you know how to have a good time. So if you just look for the item distribution of scores, say this is just for that self-awareness item, I think it was the first one on the test. Kind of looks like a normal distribution, right? So we see a lot of scores around 2, 1, and 3, and then less than 0 and 4. Let's now say we applied our diagnostic classification modeling and got the probability of mastery based upon across multiple items that the student have acquired self-awareness as indicated by our model. I saw this one, and so we have a methodologist on the project who is much more founded in DCM and IRT than I am. And I computed this, I went, oh no, what does this mean? So I took it back to Wes, and I'm like, Wes, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And he said, actually in DCM world, this is exactly what you want to see, where there's like anything in the middle between those 2 poles right there would be uncertainty. We're basically the model saying, we're basically saying the kid either has a skill or they don't, right? And there's not a lot of uncertainty in the model where kids have to fall somewhere between those 2 poles. So we're in the right direction. Which is bore out further by our diagnostic accuracy analyses, okay, where we looked and compared each of these DCM scores to one of those criterion measures. This is an area under the curve statistic, where basically values closer to 1 would suggest perfect diagnostic accuracy in predicting which kids are struggling with these skills. Usually we look for values between like anywhere from 0.8 or 0.9 and above, and we're really happy to see what we saw. So that was problem analysis. Next steps. So we have a new IES-funded project that we're really excited about that's focused on universal screening. We're building a Bayesian network that allows schools to connect their SABRES and MySABRE scores to other information that we have on those students. So we know the schools keep a lot of information, right? We have information about their demographics, their attendance, their office discipline referrals. Some schools are collecting nurse visits information now. We have a ton of information on kids. And then we get new SABRE scores, and what do we do with it? We mostly just look at it in an Excel spreadsheet and say, I don't know, let's think about what we should do. The Bayesian network is essentially meant to take that existing information, use it as like our pre-test probability of risk, then we collect new screening information and we get a post-test probability of risk, basically saying the same score might not mean the same thing for each kid, right? So now that we have that existing information about them, we get a new screener, we might get a new updated understanding of what their probability for risk is. If we all stay real quiet and we don't jinx this, because I'm not sure yet. We got questions back from WT Grant Foundation on another grant. We're building cost simulation software for schools that basically they can use to say, well, what is the long-term cost and benefit to adopting certain mental health practices, including screening? So they can do what-if analyses that allow them to understand, like, well, maybe if I adopt this, I have a short-term cost that is actually mitigated over time by sustained implementation. So something that like school administrators or school mental health leaders could use to understand, should I actually be adopting this evidence-based practice or not? Thank you.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions. If you have more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for that. In your conversations with, sounds like you've engaged well with schools and teachers about how to use this. I'm curious if you've asked them about the question on awareness, on their self-awareness. I wonder if you've heard from them, like what differentiates sort of the teachers who have a little bit more awareness than others, and what can they learn? I feel like that's a very common challenge in the schools.
It is, and so actually there's plenty of research to suggest too that teachers with higher social emotional competence tend to have kids with higher social emotional competence. It's one of the reasons people haven't seen it. People heard of the second step curriculum before? The Committee for Children that publishes Second Step just launched Adult Second Step, which is essentially meant to be social emotional learning for teachers. Because I think it's speaking to the same thing, that we actually know that the scores that we get back are likely correlated with teacher understanding of this. What we often say to schools is that we might get a screener or another measure that we think is about student social emotional functioning, or about student behavior. But really at the end of the day, our scores are teachers' perceptions of whatever that construct is. So we shouldn't be surprised when those things that we know about the teacher correlate with their scores, because it's likely that teachers have better self-awareness on their own, rate kids differently based upon their self-awareness as well. It's a good question. You pick.
You touched on this, and I may not have followed well, but how did you guys consider social desirability, both from the teacher and the student, as far as disruptive behaviors and that sort of thing?
So it's actually something that we're working on now to include new items and new scales corresponding to social desirability, particularly for students. But one thing that we haven't seen on teacher reports before is basically looking for a flag that's probability that this isn't good data, because we know that teachers know that there's a social communication aspect to their ratings, right? So if the teacher fills out the savers for their entire class, we see, this is anecdotal, but what we want to build towards and make it empirical, is that we see some teachers that are like, I'm sick of you giving me inappropriate suggestions about how my kids, all my kids are fine, stay out of my room, versus a teacher that's really struggling, really wants support, just like, we're dying in here, and they're putting all their scores in the other direction. So we haven't done that yet, but it's something we're actively working on right now because it's super necessary. Yeah.
Can you speak to whether issues like class size or time of year play any role in kind of congruence between in the assessment portion? And then do you have any thoughts on kind of optimal kind of window in assessment? So I was surprised by your range of grades, and I wonder whether or not there's an optimal period to do these assessments that may be informative down the road.
Sure. So the first question was about the class size, and what was the other one?
Time of year.
Time of year.
Like if you run the assessment early in the year, is that worse than middle or end of the year?
Sure. So essentially what we find is there isn't actually a ton of movement across, and this has actually been replicated by other groups across other screeners as well, is that in the absence of really systematic intervention, there's not a lot of movement of kids across risk ranges within a year. There's a small number of them, but it's not very huge, and that's consistent across student and teacher ratings as well. So we suggest that overall there's not a lot of change, and there's not a lot of change in the correspondence between the scores. But what we do recommend is based upon that is there's a lot of schools that have moved to triennial screening. So they screen in fall, winter, and spring to see how kids are moving across the year, but it also informs program evaluation. How are we doing? Is risk decreasing? What we recommend there, though, is that initial fall screening not take place until about 4 to 6 weeks into the school year. Kids get the time to adjust back into their new instructional setting. Teachers get the time to know their kids. I was just working on, we have a multi-site study going on, and one site screened too early, and now the teachers are asking to re-screen their kids because they think after the first 2 weeks things have changed a bit. So we tend to say give kids some time to settle in, give some time teachers to get to build those relationships, because it's really about having a good understanding of kids to know what does this pattern of behavior actually mean.
Well, thank you again. Please give it up for Dr.